We're slap bang in the middle of the Danube River. Over there is Croatia. Over there, Serbia. Here is the town of Vukovar, where 30 years ago, as a young journalist, I came to witness the opening salvos in what was a bitter and bloody battle for the breakup of Yugoslavia. Here is the Hotel Danube, where I was based all those years ago during the battle for Vukovar. There was this constant bombardment from all sides. From this side, we were taking rocket and shell fire, there was sniper fire. Here on the Danube itself, there were gunboats. And in the air, there were also planes from the Yugoslavian Air Force. The siege of the Croatian city of Vukovar by the Serb-led Yugoslav army was to last 87 days. By its end, the city was in ruins. Some of the Croatian defenders escaped. Some were captured and sent to concentration camps. Several hundred were killed in a massacre by Serb paramilitaries. Both siege and massacre set a bloody template for the kind of violence which was to afflict this region during the various wars of the 1990s. It was also the first of my own trips here as a reporter. I covered the conflict beginning, middle, and end. I had a near miss here, possibly the worst of my career. I was convinced I was going to die here. And to this day, I don't know the reason why it didn't. The Balkans is a complicated place. For most of the 20th century, most of the Balkans made up a single country called Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was made up of 6 republics: Serbia, Slovenia, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. People here tend to have a strong ethnic identity, a sense of difference which is increased by religion. Serbs, Macedonians, and Montenegrins are mostly Orthodox Christian. Slovenes and Croats are mostly Catholic. Bosniaks and most Albanians are Muslim. In 1941, the Nazis invaded Yugoslavia and set up the independent state of Croatia. This genocidal regime took part enthusiastically not only in the Holocaust against the Jews, but also sought to eradicate Serbs and Roma. The levels of brutality shocked even the German generals who were nominally in charge. Estimates as to the number of Serbian dead start at over 200,000 people. After World War II, the place was unified by the former communist partisan leader Marshal Tito, for the most part a popular strongman who oversaw decades of peace. When Tito died in 1980, old enmities and ambitions began to bubble up. By 1991, the Serb leader Slobodan Milosevic had embarked on a project to turn Yugoslavia into something more like a greater Serbia. The Serbs dominated the Yugoslav army and used it to try to take over areas of Croatia and Bosnia which had ethnic Serb communities. This was the beginning of a series of brutal ethnic wars which went on in one form or another for almost 10 years. And the first place the Serbs attacked was here in Vukovar. My old friend Alan Davis and I were young reporters, and we were determined to get into the surrounded city. We talked to the Serb commanders who agreed to let us through.
And they advised us not to do it.
Yeah, I mean, but you know, that's...
But we were young and handsome and bold, and we did what we had to do.
And incredibly stupid, really, when you're looking back on it. It was over this way, wasn't it? I mean, the tanks were positioned around here.
Well, we just walked up and we kind of suddenly saw 3 tanks, I think, behind that building. But obviously this road was totally empty.
Yeah.
And it was the sense of emptiness and quiet.
A real sense of foreboding, you know.
Yeah. That first day, having walked in, you thought, great, we've done a great thing. Then the next thing is
How are we going to get out?
How are we going to get out? Going to have to do it again?
We moved away from the Yugoslav army lines and into the trees, where we were greeted by the Croatian defenders. They accepted our credentials and welcomed us in. As we moved into town, it became apparent that this was a conflict which had escalated badly, and it was one where the lightly armed defenders were seriously outgunned.
Vukovar was a lovely kind of middle-class town in Croatia and Yugoslavia, and not overnight, but within the space of a few weeks, things changed. This whole area was destroyed.
We were driven this last section into the square opposite the Hotel Danube, yeah?
Alan and I stayed at the Hotel Danube on the banks of the river. There were other journalists there, and we soon figured out that we'd entered a really dangerous situation.
I kind of freaked out a little bit when the receptionist, Marianne, he kind of said, you know, when you're walking around outside of that hotel, be careful of snipers and that kind of thing.
From across the river?
Yeah, that kind of sobered me up somewhat. He's the only receptionist I knew who had a...
pump-action shotgun? And a sniper rifle?
And a sniper rifle, kept it behind the desk.
Where was the wasn't there a cafe, the cafe on the square or something?
Well,
there's the one we were in, was it definitely that
That's
one?
where we saw them play chess, the
two old
man.
fellas playing chess.
One Croat, and they said this is the real battle of Vukovar. They joshed. Little did they know.
Was it third or fourth floor?
I think it was the fourth floor. We didn't have the deluxe balcony. We didn't have the room with the view, the cheap seats. And as you say, I think the sign was very much the same.
The sign's the same.
The hotel is ruined now. In reality, it was refurbished after the war and has simply fallen into disrepair again. But it reminds me of the way it looked in 1991.
What I remember about the basement was you saying it was quite claustrophobic, small. It was a sort of dilemma. Stay upstairs, potentially a round comes in, shrapnel glass flying around everywhere. Like you, I thought, well, if you're going to cop it, I'd rather be outside than kind of buried alive. And that little door off to the right is where Marion dragged us in. That was a hellish day's shelling.
We meet with one of the men who defended Vukovar back in 1991, a former pilot called Ivan. I asked him how things started to go so badly wrong.
Recimo sam išao sa Srbima u osnovnu školu, u srednju školu, da sam skupa s njima igrao nogomet, da smo se družili, da smo najnormalnije funkcionirali, znači i u školama, i kroz sport, i kroz sve. I onda, kada je došlo do 1991. sve je bilo podijeljeno. Znači, točno se znao ko je Srbin, ko je Hrvat. Kad je bila velikosrpska, znači teritorijalna, oni su jednostavno pretendirali na hrvatski teritorij i znači došlo je do toga da je Hrvatska znači konstruirala svoju državu. Tog trenutka je znači došlo do otvorene agresije i normalno došlo je do velike podjele. Politička propaganda, znači koja je ta mašinerija, znači tog srpskog fašizma, je učinila svoje da su jednostavno oni te ljude toliko, ajmo reći, preobratili, da su oni došli u situaciju da nas vide kao najveći neprijatelji.
Did you think at the time maybe I should leave?
No. Ja sam bio uvjeren da mi ne možemo pasti, da ne možemo izgubiti grad. Znači, bio sam uvjeren da ne možemo izgubiti grad. Ostao sam tu zato što su tu ostali svi moji susjedi, svi moji prijatelji, roditelji, znači svi oni ljudi sa kojima sam ja živio, znači oni su ostali ovdje. Mislim da sam pobjegao, da nikad više tim ljudima ne bi mogao pogledati u oči. Nije to bilo života, pa to je bio totalni rat. Znači, jednostavno ono, živio si dan za dan da ne izgubiš glavu, znači bila je bitka, ono, nije, to je bilo ono, takva bitka gdje si ti nisi imao vremena razmišljati, nisi ti imao tu vremena razmišljati.
Fighting wore on through October and into November. Food and ammunition supplies dwindled. The defenders were holding out for relief from the newly formed Croatian army, but it never came. Alan and I managed to get back out to safety before the end. We were among the last Western journalists to leave.
What was the lowest point?
Znači, onda dan recimo kada smo se mi morali predati i izaći iz grada, znači i onda su oni izdvojili znači sve muškarce i sve muškarce strpali u logore, a ženu i djecu su navažali nekoliko dana po Srbiji dok ih nisu pustili u Hrvatsku. Kada smo mi bili priznati 1992. godine, znači ja sam bio u logoru, ali onoga trenutka kad smo mi u logoru doživjeli priznanje Hrvatske države, oni su nas cijeli dan tukli. A naravno mi smo bili sretni jer smo znali da više nismo pobunjenici, nego smo mi vojnici jedne države.
You said that you spent time in 3 detention camps, yeah?
Da, u Sremskoj Mitrovici, Aleksincu i Nišu. Jednostavno, iznimno težak, ne samo fizički, nego i psihički period znači, u životu. Znači, od klasične tučnjave pendrecima, električnim pendrecima, znači svim tim nekim vojničkim ašovčićima, šta su uopće imali tad pri ruci.
I'm sure it's virtually impossible to forget, given what a man's gone through. But forgive?
Da se razumijemo, znači ja ne mrzim niti jednog Srbina. Znači, nemam tih problema. Znači, nisam ih imao ni onda, a nemam ih ni danas. Ja sa Srbima najnormalnije razgovaram. Znači, najnormalnije komuniciram. Ja se, recimo, u svom životu nisam, recimo, nikad borio protiv muslimana. Ali uopće ne mrzim muslimane, uopće, znači, nemam ti predrasuda, razumijete me. Znači, ja nisam imao tih predrasuda ni kad sam izašao iz logora. Poraviti, znači, da vam neko ubije prijatelja sa kojim ste, recimo, išli u srednju školu, razumijete, sa kojim ste vezani cijeli život. Znači, teško je to zaboraviti.
If I can just show a few photographs that I took.
Fotografija.
This is not here, this is Babska.
Kovačić Damir. Znači, this is Kovačić Damir. My friend's school.
A school friend?
Yes. Bio je ranjen u bolnici i kao ranjenik iz bolnice odnesen na Ovčaru i tamo se ubio.
And he was at how?
21.
Ovcara is the name of a farm outside Vukovar. It was used as a detention camp during the siege. When the battle ended, something far darker happened there. After Croat defenders, such as Ivan, had laid down their weapons, they were taken to detention camps. They were the lucky ones. Fighting alongside the Yugoslav army were two Serbian paramilitary units who were to become notorious over the following 4 years, the White Eagles and Arkan's Tigers. The paramilitaries had the job of doing what the regular army would not. At the end of the siege, the Yugoslav army took control of the city hospital. Inside were around 300 wounded soldiers mixed up with civilians. The army separated out the men and boys and took them in buses to Ovcara. There they were beaten and handed over to the paramilitaries. For 260 medical staff and patients from Vukovar Hospital, this spot was the end of the road after the fall of Vukovar. They were bussed from a nearby pig farm to this position here, and over a period of 4 hours were shot and killed. It was the first atrocity in Europe, mass atrocity in Europe, since the Second World War, and a harbinger of things to come across the whole of Yugoslavia. This is the water tower at Vukovar. It became famous as a symbol of resistance. It was blasted by shelling, but each day the Croat defenders would hoist their flag on top of the tower, at least one paying for it with his life. Now, it's a museum dedicated to the battle, complete with original shell holes. Jelena is a local writer who works here. She lost her father in the massacre. Jelena, you were 10 years old during the siege of Vukovar. What do you remember about that time?
I remember how it started, because we never believed that this really the war is coming. We weren't even scared, but it started to be worse and worse, so we had to go out from our house. I remember we were running on the street, and behind of us were the tank.
This is your family?
Yes, me, my brother, and my mother, and my grandmother.
Right.
Because my father was working. My father was working in the hospital, so we stayed in the hospital. And the 18 September, the whole Vukovar fell down.
So your father was working in the hospital, and he was there in the hospital
Yes.
when the paramilitaries came to the hospital to take
Yes.
staff and patients from there, yeah?
Yes, all the patients, they took all the men which watched the patients and the workers of the hospital. He was the driver of the ambulance.
What do you know about what happened to your father then?
Actually, when we in the morning, all hospital had to come out. There was the major Shlivanchanin. He was outside, and he says that all the women and the children have to go to the right, and all the men go to the left.
Separated them?
Yes. All the men was put in another 6th bus and drive it to the Ovcara.
Yeah.
And
your father was among them?
My father was one of them. Actually, they was torturing all of them all night and killed them the same day. It was the day when my mother even had his birthday. She's 30th birthday.
It was her 30th birthday, and the day your father
She
was
say without the man of her life, with 2 children alone in the war.
So you found out about your father the same day or a few days later?
No, we were believing that he is in the prison of Serbia, like so many people were. We were expecting when was the changes of the prisoners. She was going to all. And she came back so sad and with the empty arms. So they found the Ovcara, which is 200 people was there. My father was one of them. We were on the identification, so with the blood and the tattoo which he had, we could really believe it that this was him. But the 6th bus was never found.
Do you think the town has healed
No, I think that it will be when all of us who was the witness of that suffering,
generation of
when
that period.
all our generations gone, maybe then here will be the more peace and the more.
But the most important thing is not to forget also.
Yes, we can't forget that. Yes, it's our history. We just have to remember because I believe if we don't talk, it might be repeated.
The siege of Vukovar was lost in the noise of greater horrors to come. The Ovcara massacre was covered up by its perpetrators. The world's attention turned to the south, where the better-known city of Dubrovnik was attacked by the Serbs in similar fashion. The victims of the Ovcara massacre were exhumed and examined forensically in Croatia after the war. 3 Yugoslav army officers were tried at The Hague by the UN Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. 2 were found guilty of charges relating to the massacre. None of the Serb paramilitaries has been convicted. In Bosnia, the war wore on for 4 brutal years, defined by ethnic cleansing and mass murder. Here, the task of sorting the dead fell to an organisation called the International Commission on Missing Persons. We're travelling south to Tuzla, where the ICMP has a base. Here, in this quiet building, are stored the remains of thousands of people. They are mainly victims of the Srebrenica genocide. At Srebrenica, Bosnian Serb forces, led by General Ratko Mladic, systematically murdered over 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men and boys. 2 international courts have ruled that Srebrenica was an act of genocide. Many Bosnian Serb political leaders reject that verdict even today. Among many found guilty of complicity in genocide and crimes against humanity, 5 Bosnian Serb leaders have received life sentences for their involvement. Not all the victims have been found. Those that have make their way here, where the quest for justice goes on more than 20 years later.
Here, storage room, it is a very important place where we keep all remains and remains of clothing. I suggest that we go.
Is this refrigerated?
Yes, it is. So this is storage room.
Ooh.
We keep all bodies here. So complete this side is full of skeletal remains. And in the paper bags, remains of clothing, personal belongings. We have here over 3,000 remains of skeletal remains and 3,000 remains of clothing. And you can see on every bag we have numbers, that is original case numbers. In the paper bags we have remains of clothing which need to be associated with bones after identifications.
So the bones and clothes are brought together?
Yes.
You probably don't notice it, but this musty smell in here,
yes,
it's a very strange smell.
It is smell probably of the bones, soft tissue, dirty, everything is mixed.
You've got used to it, I take it.
Probably.
But just looking around here, what I see is there are some bags that look, shall we say, fairly bulky, as if they've got substantial remains in them. And there are others that look as though you've got virtually nothing.
That is unfortunately the situation with Srebrenica, because those remains, mostly of those remains removed from primary locations to the secondary locations, and very often we don't find complete bodies.
When you say they were moved, you mean they were moved deliberately by the perpetrators?
Of course,
the killings?
from perpetrators, because they wanted to hide evidence. So those people died in July 1995, but after 2 or 3 months in September or October, we have some evidence that they removed some of the bodies in 1996, in January and February.
Right.
They wanted to hide evidence.
So it was a cover-up, effectively?
Yes, and they would open again primary grave, and with big machines, with trucks, they would remove those bodies on the other locations. So they created basically from several primary graves, they created a lot secondary locations. And what is the issue? The composition of bodies already started after 3 or 4 months of death. So when they remove those bodies with big machines, they destroy the integrity of the individual. So very often we find remains of one person in more different locations, sometimes in more different mass graves.
So it's like a composite. Presumably you're putting together almost, I know it's an odd comparison, but it's kind of a jigsaw puzzle, really,
Of course, like
of
puzzle.
pieces from
Very
different
often,
locations.
yes, I always give example of one person which we found in 4 different mass graves on 15 different locations. So in Srebrenica cases, approximately to identify one person, we have to take 7 DNA samples.
Do most families, in the main, wish to know what happened, do you think?
For most families, it is very important that we find at least one bone because they want to closure that story.
Yeah.
They want to bury the remains. They need that monument. They need place where they can go. I think that is very important to them to move forward.
Are there any particular cases in that duration of 15 years that kind of stand out in your mind for any particular reason?
I remember several cases, but only from scientific reasons. I try not to think a lot about that impact.
So this is the examination room.
Yeah, this is the examination room, autopsy room, where I do all examination of the skeletal remains. This is new case,
Right.
which I received last week. And this is complete body, but lots of bones missing.
So, just to be clear, these are the bones
from one person.
from one person. What's this?
We
noise
have
at the top?
soft tissue, little bit of hair, and skull fragments. It's missing lots of elements. It's missing torso, ribs, arms not complete, feet not present. It's after 20 years of that.
I suppose the first reaction that I have when I come in here is how little there is to work with. What a complicated, complex kind of piecing together.
It is very complicated, but we are lucky because we found a way to identify individuals. Without DNA testing, really, it wouldn't be possible to identify such a high number without making mistakes.
We're on our way to Sarajevo. It's the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and it is now what it once was, a thriving multicultural European capital. During the war, it was subject to a bloody siege as the Bosnian Serb army attempted to strangle their Muslim brethren into submission. I was here during and after the siege. The only way in by land was via a winding supply route through the mountains, twisting around behind Serb lines. The siege was to last almost 4 years, from May 1992 to February 1996. Life for the people of Sarajevo was shattered. Even simple tasks such as getting water or food became life or death moments. The Serbs rained down artillery, mortar and sniper fire on the city, but they could not break the will of the Sarajevan people.
This is Trebavica, and this was a restaurant before the war, built for the Olympic Games, obviously totally derelict now, and was used as a Serb shelling position during the war, and you can see why. It's an incredible view and a very, very important strategic point. Now we can look straight down. I can see the City Hall building, the hospital, which was shelled during the war, and indeed Sarajevo Stadium, football stadium over there, which is obviously a key landmark as well. So it's very easy to pick out individual positions within the city. Every conceivable type of heavy weaponry used on the city itself from here. Tank shells, mortars, rockets.
After years of inertia from the international community, NATO began limited airstrikes on the Serb forces surrounding the city. The siege was finally lifted in February 1996. In the peace which followed, Bosnia and Herzegovina was divided into two political entities under the supervision of a UN-appointed High Representative. One, a federation of Bosniaks and Croats, the other, the Serb pseudo-state of Republika Srpska. This is the uneasy settlement which persists to this day. Several Serb commanders were found guilty of war crimes for their role in the siege. General Dragomir Milosevic, the Serb leader Radovan Karadzic, and his chief commander, General Ratko Mladic. When the war ended in 1996, I came back to Sarajevo and lived here for a while. I worked for an NGO which supported journalists.
This is the banks of the river, right in the heart of Sarajevo, very centre. This street in particular was very exposed. You can see the high hills on the other side from which Serb fire, both shell fire, tank fire, rocket fire, and indeed snipers shooting down at civilians here in the streets. In this direction is the airport, a good few miles out, with the famous airport run snipers alley, as it was known, which you used to come in high speed in cars. Really, it was very dangerous speeding along that street.
There's a photographer based in Sarajevo called Damir Shagolje. He served in the Bosnian army during the war and afterwards began to make a career as a photographer, specialising in war and humanitarian catastrophe. It's always good to meet a fellow traveller, especially in his favourite bar.
I come from Bosnia. Right, 1995, end of the war in Bosnia. I was totally broken, just like every single one of us. Had penniless, no money, no future, nothing. So it's not that I had a number of options that I could choose from, and then I picked up conflict photography.
All conflicts are brutal, but there seems to be, or was something about the conflict here that was really exceptional. Is that an exaggeration? Or am I imagining that, or is it different?
No.
And if it is different, what makes it different here?
What I believe that made a big difference between Sarajevo and similar places is that, first of all, it lasted very long. Right? It was very intense 4 years. But also, once you are in Sarajevo, I'm talking about Sarajevo in particular, you are part of it.
You and I have witnessed criminal activity in war zones across the world. But would it be fair to say that it was something particularly brutal about? I can't get my head around this. Turning on your neighbour, the person you went to school with. Where do you think that comes from?
I don't think that's unique for Bosnia. You had neighbors turning on to neighbors in many places around the world. That's the war. Very often the front lines go through the living rooms. What was happening here, I think that the perception of people like you who came here, this was the place where you come and you go to a place that was bombed, let's say, an apartment, and you go and you look at the collection of the LPs and the books in that apartment, and you go like, this could have been my apartment. So all of a sudden, it's not a third world.
It's not alien. It's not a faraway place.
All of a sudden, this is happening to a man that is practically the same as you. Right? Photography, especially war photography, is like a drug, no? Like fucking heroin.
You know, a lot of people say that. It is addictive, yeah?
Well, of course.
Would you say you'd been addicted?
Of course.
Well, but what about when the fix wears off, though? See, I found that more problematic.
When you enter the war zone, when you go into that zone, you basically go against everybody else. Everybody else is running away.
Trying to get
from
out.
it. So by the fact that you're going against everybody, it tells you that you're doing something irrational. So you're trying to be rational within an irrational. So you have to be rational more than when you're outside.
We should have a shrink sitting here right now.
So you're flying 10,000 meters altitude, 1,000 kilometers an hour for 10 years. And you want to land. No, it's not going to go.
Do you have a
like
crash
this.
landing?
Tell me somebody that didn't. If people tell you that they didn't, they're lying or they're Superman.
I've had a few really bad crash landings over the years, I have to say.
It would be stupid to think that otherwise is possible.
I think the sad thing too is that those crash landings bring with them collateral damage. Relationships, friendships, you know.
Everything. And then talking about that from the perspective of somebody who worked for a BBC or a big corporation from a civilized, well-organized country, it's one thing. Talking about somebody who is coming from the country that's a different ball game. Trust me. If you have a problem, you go home to BBC or to Scotland and you say, I have a problem. What happens? They help you. That you're not gonna get support and understanding from the society because society is fucked up. You're not gonna get it, all those safety nets that you're talking about, the way the white privileged man from West gets when he gets in trouble. If you're a photographer from India or from Pakistan or from Bosnia or from Palestine, from Africa or from Myanmar, and something happens to you,
No one's picking up the pieces. I've never felt comfortable with that, you know.
so what are you gonna do about it? Nothing.
Yeah.
That's how it is. It's
I mean, you've spent decades, as I have, in this line of work. Do you regret it?
every single day of my life. They're the two most stupid things that I did in my life. I lived abroad before the war, and I came back just before the war because war was about to start. And the other thing, also very stupid, is that I did what I did after the war with another 25 years of conflict. But both of those things, stupid things, I'm extremely proud of, and I would do them again.
Again, I've questioned myself about it so many times and wondered, you know, should I be doing something else? What now? If tomorrow morning, would you be back in a conflict zone? Would you be off doing another?
I just think that I had enough. You know, it's like it's like if you take this spoon, you know. So here we are bending a spoon. If I do one more time, it's gonna snap.
Snap.
Right? So if I can just leave it
A little bit bent.
just a little bit bent, okay, from time to time, you know, you do a little bit of this, so maybe it works again. And then see in 20 years, you know.
Okay.
I don't know. Who knows?
Who knows?
No, I
Maybe
don't
we'll
think
have this conversation in the future.
so. There you are.
Hopefully, we haven't snapped by then.
Yes.
All the best.
All the best.
Though I spent time in Sarajevo, my experience of the Yugoslav wars always seemed to have a Croatian accent. I began my travels in Vukovar and saw the heroism of the defenders. I also spent a lot of time in the south, where some of the worst and most tragic fighting of the wars took place. Mostar, the largest city in Herzegovina. At the beginning, the Croats and Muslims of Bosnia and Herzegovina were united against the Bosnian Serb aggression. But in Mostar, that unity slipped. The Croat militia, the HVO, tried to take over the city in the name of their imagined Bosnian Croat state and with the backing of Croatia itself. The Bosnian army resisted and the city was torn in two. Thousands of Bosnian Muslims were ethnically cleansed from the western part of Mostar and its surrounding villages. It was used, as it was elsewhere, as a weapon of war. Civilians were shelled indiscriminately. Mosques were deliberately destroyed. The symbol of Mostar, the ancient bridge known as Stari Most, was broken by Croat shelling. By the end of the war, the population of Mostar, which had previously been mixed, had been completely polarised. Bosniaks lived in the east, Croats in the west. It remains so, largely to this day. While some Bosnian army soldiers were convicted of crimes against Croat prisoners, the burden of guilt fell clearly on the Bosnian Croat leadership. 6 senior leaders were convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity in The Hague. Two local HVO commanders were singled out for their brutality. Mladen Miletilic and Vinko Martinovic, known as Tuta and Stella.
This place is called the Heliodrom. It was formerly a military barracks, but during the war it was used as a concentration camp. Something like 20,000 people were processed here. By processed, I mean they were detained, tortured, beaten by the HVO who ran this camp here. The building in which most people were actually detained is at the far end here. There is no access to this. But the main building where they were held, most people were held, is on the other side of the grounds here. Dobar dan.
Nije ovdje niko. Ovdje ti nije niko bio u zatvorenicu. Niks. Ovdje niko nije.
There's no signage, there's nothing here at all to suggest what it was during the war. There's no plaque, there's no signage at all. There were people convicted at the War Crimes Tribunal who ran this camp. But again, the denial continues today. This is the town of Chitluk, not far from Mostar. The militias here, the HVO militias here, had an infamous reputation for their brutality and their atrocities.
You have reached your destination.
Looking round Chitluk now, you know, it's such a kind of peaceful, benign kind of backwater, you know. It's hard to imagine that all those years ago, you know, these individuals and these groups were operating here, you know, with such barbarity. I mean, really extraordinary barbarism. As you would expect in an area like this, a town like Chitluk, you know, they're paying homage to Vukovar, where Croats made the stand, of course, against the Yugoslav National Army and Serb paramilitaries. going through this underpass, and you know, like many places that has graffiti, there's a lot of Nazi, neo-Nazi kind of imagery here, swastikas and references to militias and right-wing militias. Quaint little place. Still got the badges of these war crimes units on the town's walls. This was a notorious area, and it was here I was brought by some militia, HVO militia, from Mostar back in 93, 94, just the tail end of 94. And the people who brought me here, to all intents and purposes, were friendly. We were drinking with them. Promises of being able to accompany them as a journalist, tell their story with their units. But it all turned very sour, very nasty, and they ended up effectively kidnapping me here. And it's so bizarre standing in the middle of this town, around this hotel area where I was initially brought. And it all turned very sour here. And eventually I was taken out of town to an outhouse in the countryside and held there for some time. I was beaten over the course of a few days, very, very badly. They held me at this outhouse for 2-3 days. I'm not really quite sure actually, because I was constantly being beaten. I had umpteen broken bones, broken collarbone, broken ribs. And there I was tied, made to kneel down, and a gun was put to my head, and there was a lot of argument between the guys who were drunk. I suspect one wanted to kill me, one didn't. The other one was too drunk to bother, and the gun was put to my head, cocked, and the trigger was pulled. And the gun didn't go off, or it was a mock execution, I'm not sure. They hit me on the head, and I ended up unconscious and came to some time later. This is definitely, this area is where I came around here when I came back out onto the main road. Now, I'm just going to go along to the end of the track here, okay? No question about it. Because it's the wall here I remember, but there was also a fence running down here because I managed to cut myself free on the fence. I remember being really, really thirsty. I remember the dike. It was a different, this gate wasn't here. There was a different old fence that I used to cut the ties on my wrists. And it took me forever to get from there to the road. It was like an eternity coming up this road. Got to the road, I was there, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes or so, half an hour. And I realised I had to flag down the first vehicle, you know, not knowing whether, you know, there would be more militia or bad guys, whatever. Unfortunately, they weren't. They were really kind. They were clearly smoking weed at the time and asked me if I. And I did. I took a large draw on the joint, and it lifted the pain, you know, because my ribs, especially my shoulder, were really, really painful at that point in time. So it just lifted the pain that little bit. It was fantastic, a wonderful feeling, actually. I was convinced I was going to die here. Convinced. And to this day, I don't know the reason why I didn't, frankly. Oh, man. Ironic. Do you see what the inscription says? Just down there, effectively, was the spot where a war crime was committed against myself. And yet right here is a monument that actually commemorates those victims that stood trial for war crimes at The Hague. I mean, you couldn't make that up. They're clearly in denial. Well, that was very unpleasant, I have to say.
This is Dubrovnik, our final stop. It's good to see the sea. This place too was besieged and shelled by the Serb-led Yugoslav army right back at the beginning of the war. The same tactic, the same devastating results. It was taken back by the Croatian army a year later, but not before the Old Town, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, had been partially destroyed. You wouldn't know to look at it now. Just goes to show that the wounds of war can heal. The outward ones, at least.